June 16th, 1995. Michael Jackson released an album that nobody expected, not because it was experimental or artistically daring, but because it was angry, openly, unapologetically angry. The album was called History, Past, Present, and Future, Book 1, a double album. Disc 1 was greatest hits. Disc 2 was 15 new songs, and those 15 songs represented the first time in Michael Jackson's career that he stopped trying to please everyone and started fighting back. The promotional campaign was unprecedented. Giant statues of Michael, 9 stories tall, were erected in cities across Europe. Michael in military uniform, arms crossed, staring down at the people below. The imagery was deliberately provocative, totalitarian. Some critics compared it to Soviet-era propaganda. Others saw echoes of fascist iconography. Michael didn't care. Or maybe he did care, and that was the point. He wanted people uncomfortable. He wanted them to pay attention. Because he had something to say and he was done asking politely for people to listen. This is the story of history. Not just the album, but what it represented. The moment Michael Jackson stopped being the victim and became something else. Something angrier, something more dangerous, and something ultimately more isolated. Because anger, when it's your primary mode of communication, doesn't bring people closer. It pushes them away. And history, for all its commercial success, marked the beginning of Michael's final descent into a place where rage and paranoia became indistinguishable from self-expression. To understand history, you have to understand what Michael had been through in the 2 years before its release. August 1993. Jordan Chandler, a 13-year-old boy, accused Michael of sexual abuse. The allegations became international news. Michael's home at Neverland Ranch was searched by police. He was required to undergo a strip search, where investigators photographed his body to compare with descriptions provided by the accuser. The humiliation was profound. The media coverage was relentless, and the court of public opinion rendered its verdict long before any legal process concluded. In January 1994, Michael settled the civil case with the Chandler family for a reported sum between $15 and $25 million. No criminal charges were filed. Michael maintained his innocence. His lawyers said the settlement was necessary to avoid a prolonged trial that would be devastating regardless of outcome. But the public saw it differently. To many, the settlement looked like an admission of guilt. Why would an innocent man pay millions to make accusations disappear? The damage to Michael's reputation was catastrophic. Before 1993, he was eccentric but beloved, the king of pop, a musical genius with strange habits. After 1993, every quirk was reframed as evidence of pathology. His love of children became suspect. His Neverland Ranch became sinister. His entire public persona was re-examined through a lens of suspicion. And Michael, who had spent his entire life performing and pleasing and trying to be loved, suddenly found himself cast as a monster. The emotional toll was enormous. People close to Michael during this period described him as devastated, not just by the legal process or the financial cost, but by the betrayal. He'd believed that his talent and his generosity would protect him, that people would see him for who he really was. And instead, they'd turned on him. The media, which had once celebrated him, now treated him as a punchline or a predator. Fans who'd screamed his name now questioned whether they'd been deceived, and Michael, isolated at Neverland, surrounded by staff and handlers and hangers-on, had nowhere to process his rage except in the studio. History was that processing. Every song on the second disc was in some way a response to what had happened. Some were subtle, others were direct to the point of confrontation, and the overall message was clear. Michael Jackson was done apologizing for who he was, done trying to make people comfortable. He was going to say what he felt, and if people didn't like it, that was their problem. The album sessions began in 1994 while the Chandler case was still being resolved. Michael worked with multiple producers, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, Dallas Austin, R. Kelly, and, returning to the fold after a break, his longtime collaborator Bruce Sweetein. But the creative control was entirely Michael's. He knew what he wanted to say, and he wasn't interested in being talked out of it. The title itself was significant. History. Not history as in the past, but his story. Michael's story. The narrative he wanted to tell about himself, in opposition to the narrative the media was telling. The album cover reinforced this, a massive golden statue of Michael in military regalia. Authoritarian, imposing, the kind of image that demands attention and refuses to be ignored. The promotional campaign took the concept even further. Sony spent an estimated $30 million on marketing. They commissioned those giant statues, floated them down rivers in European cities, erected them in public squares. The spectacle was intentional. Michael wanted to be unavoidable, wanted people to look up and see him towering over them. It was a power move, a middle finger to everyone who'd tried to diminish him. But the songs themselves were where the real message lived. Scream. The opening track and lead single was a duet with Michael's sister Janet, a song about media harassment and invasion of privacy. The lyrics were direct, references to being tired of injustice, tired of the schemes. The music video, directed by Mark Romanek, was the most expensive ever made at the time. Estimated at $7 million, black and white, futuristic. Michael and Janet in a spaceship, smashing things, screaming their frustration into the void. It was cathartic. And it was a statement. Michael wasn't hiding, he was fighting. They Don't Care About Us was even more confrontational. Two versions exist. The original included lyrics that referenced Jews and others in ways that sparked immediate controversy. Jewish organizations condemned the song. Michael defended it, saying he was criticizing all forms of oppression, not targeting any specific group. But the backlash was intense. He eventually re-recorded the offending lines. The controversy overshadowed the song's broader message, which was about systemic injustice and persecution. But that was the problem with history. Michael's anger was so raw, so unfiltered, that it often obscured the actual points he was trying to make. The song's music videos reflected Michael's state of mind. Two versions were filmed. One in a Brazilian favela, directed by Spike Lee, showing poverty and police violence. The other in a prison, with Michael surrounded by guards and inmates, everyone performing choreographed routines. The imagery was aggressive. Michael in chains, Michael behind bars, Michael as a political prisoner. It wasn't subtle, but subtlety had never gotten him anywhere, so he went for impact. Tabloid Junkie addressed the media directly. The lyrics called out journalists and tabloid culture, accused them of creating lies for profit, of destroying lives for headlines. Michael's vocal delivery was sharp, bitter. This wasn't the smooth crooner of Billie Jean. This was someone who'd been burned and wanted the world to know who lit the match. The bridge included spoken word elements. Michael's voice layered and distorted, paranoid and accusatory. It was uncomfortable to listen to. And that was the point. DS was perhaps the most controversial track on the album. The initials stood for multiple things depending on who you asked. District Attorney or a specific person. Tom Sneddon, the Santa Barbara County District Attorney, who'd led the 1993 investigation into Michael. The lyrics were thinly veiled attacks, references to someone who wanted to destroy him, who was motivated by prejudice and ambition. Michael didn't hide his contempt. The song was aggressive, rock-influenced, angry in ways that felt personal because it was. Not every song on history was about the allegations. Earth Song was an environmental anthem, orchestral and grand. Michael singing about ecological destruction and human greed. It became a massive hit internationally, though it was never released as a single in the United States. You Are Not Alone, yet written and produced by R. Kelly, was a ballad about loneliness and connection. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the first song in history to do so. And Childhood, written for the film Free Willy 2, was Michael's most direct attempt to explain himself. The lyrics talked about having no childhood, about being forced to grow up too fast, about people judging him without understanding his past. but even the softer songs carried weight in the context of the album. You Are Not Alone could be heard as Michael reaching out to fans who still believed in him. Childhood was a plea for empathy, and Earth Song, while ostensibly about the planet, also felt like Michael positioning himself as a martyr, someone fighting for noble causes while being attacked by small-minded people. The entire album was structured around this narrative. Michael as victim. Michael as fighter. Michael as misunderstood genius, standing against a corrupt and hypocritical world. The commercial performance of History was strong but complicated. It debuted at #1 in multiple countries, sold millions of copies worldwide. Scream and You Are Not Alone were both major hits, but in the United States the reception was cooler. Critics were divided. Some praised Michael's willingness to be vulnerable and angry. Others found the album self-indulgent and overly defensive. The general public, still processing the allegations, didn't embrace it the way they'd embraced Thriller or Bad. The History World Tour, which ran from 1996 to 1997, was similarly mixed. The shows were spectacles, elaborate production, pyrotechnics, choreography. Michael performing his classics alongside the new material, but reports from people who attended described the performances as mechanical. Michael going through the motions, the joy that had once defined his stage presence was gone. Replaced by professionalism and precision, but lacking soul? And behind the scenes, according to those who worked on the tour, Michael was struggling. Physically exhausted, emotionally drained. The anger that had fueled History wasn't sustainable. You can't live in a state of constant rage without it destroying you. And Michael, who'd already been isolated before the album, found himself even more alone afterward. Because anger doesn't build bridges, it burns them. The promotional statues became a symbol of everything History represented. In Budapest, a statue was floated down the Danube. In London, it was placed in a public square. In Berlin, it stood near the Brandenburg Gate. The images were striking. Michael as Colossus, Michael as icon, Michael as dictator. The comparisons to authoritarian imagery weren't accidental. Michael wanted to provoke, wanted to make people uncomfortable, wanted them to question why they were so quick to tear him down. But the statues also revealed something tragic. This was a man who felt so powerless in his actual life that he needed to project an image of overwhelming power. The statues were compensation, a fantasy of control in a world where Michael controlled almost nothing. Not the media narrative, not public opinion, not even increasingly his own career and finances. Critics of History pointed to the album as evidence of Michael's disconnect from reality. They said he was surrounding himself with yes-men who enabled his worst impulses, that the album's anger was misdirected, that instead of addressing the actual allegations, he was lashing out at abstractions. The media, society, injustice. And while those critiques weren't entirely fair, Michael had legitimate grievances about how he'd been treated. They weren't entirely wrong either. History was an album made by someone who'd retreated so far into his own perspective that he couldn't see how it would be received. He thought people would rally behind him, recognize his pain, join his fight against the forces attacking him. Instead, many people heard a rich man complaining about consequences. The Jewish community's response to "they don't care about us" exemplified this disconnect. Michael genuinely believed he was making a statement about oppression, about how marginalized groups are scapegoated and persecuted. But by using specific inflammatory language, he undermined his own message. And when he defended the lyrics instead of immediately apologizing, he made it worse. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout Michael's later career. Good intentions, sabotaged by poor execution, and an inability to hear criticism. History also marked a shift in how Michael saw his own role. Before 1993, he'd positioned himself as an entertainer, someone whose job was to bring joy, to make people dance, to create moments of transcendence through music and performance. After 1993, he saw himself as something else. A prophet, a truth teller, a victim of conspiracy. The messianic complex that had always been part of his persona, evident in songs like Man in the Mirror and Heal the World, became more pronounced. He wasn't just making music, he was fighting a war, and wars require enemies. The problem was that Michael's enemies were vague. The media, the system, they. He never got specific enough to make his critiques actionable, and so the anger in history felt diffuse. Scattershot. He was mad at everything and everyone, which meant he wasn't effectively mad at anyone. The album was a primal scream. Cathartic for Michael, maybe, but not transformative for his listeners. The songs on history that have aged best are the ones that transcend the immediate context. Earth Song remains powerful because environmental destruction is timeless. You Are Not Alone endures because loneliness is universal. Childhood resonates because anyone who's felt misunderstood can connect with it. But the songs that were most personal to Michael D.S. Tabloid Junkie, Money, Feel Dated, artifacts of a specific moment, interesting as historical documents, but not the kind of songs that invite repeated listening decades later. And that's the fundamental tension of history. It was Michael's most honest album, the one where he stopped performing a persona and just said what he felt. But honesty without craft is just venting, and venting, while personally necessary, doesn't always make for great art. The best songs on history are the ones where Michael balanced his anger with songwriting discipline, where he channeled his pain into something universal rather than something petty. The failure of history, if we can call it that, wasn't commercial. The album sold. The tour sold out. Michael remained one of the biggest stars on the planet, but history failed to achieve what Michael wanted it to achieve. It didn't change minds, didn't rehabilitate his image, didn't make people see him as the victim of injustice rather than the perpetrator. If anything, it reinforced existing opinions. People who believed in Michael's innocence heard vindication. People who believed in his guilt heard denial. Nobody crossed over. Nobody changed their position because of an angry double album. And Michael, expecting a different outcome, was disappointed. According to people close to him during this period, he became more paranoid after History's release, more convinced that powerful forces were aligned against him, more isolated in his belief that only he could see the truth. The album was supposed to be a turning point. Instead, it was a confirmation. The world wasn't going to forgive him, wasn't going to forget, and no amount of anger or artistic expression was going to change that. The legacy of history is complicated. It's not remembered the way Thriller or Bad are remembered. It doesn't have the cultural impact of Off the Wall. But it's significant because it's the moment Michael Jackson stopped trying to be universally loved and started trying to be understood. And those are very different goals. Being loved requires compromise, requires giving people what they want. Being understood requires honesty, requires showing who you actually are, even if people don't like it. History was Michael showing who he actually was in 1995. Angry, hurt, defiant, paranoid, messianic, petty, talented, isolated, all of it. And the world looked at that portrait and largely turned away. Not because the portrait was inaccurate, but because it was uncomfortable. People wanted Michael Jackson, the performer, the moonwalker, the voice behind Billie Jean. They didn't want Michael Jackson, the wounded human being, demanding they acknowledge his pain. In retrospect, history feels like a missed opportunity. If Michael had been willing to be more vulnerable and less aggressive, the album could have been a genuine act of catharsis. If he'd focused less on attacking his enemies and more on expressing his actual emotions, fear, sadness, confusion, it might have connected more deeply. But that would have required Michael to admit weakness. And weakness, in his worldview, was dangerous. Admitting you were hurt meant admitting you could be hurt. And for someone who'd been hurt as much as Michael had, that admission was unbearable. So instead, he chose anger, chose defiance, chose to build giant statues of himself and dare the world to knock them down. And the world, predictably, did. Not literally. The statues came down on their own after the promotional campaign ended, but figuratively. symbolically. The image Michael tried to project powerful, unassailable, larger than life collapsed under its own weight. Because you can't force people to see you a certain way. You can only show them who you are and hope they understand. And history showed a Michael Jackson who was too angry to be understood, too defensive to be sympathetic, too isolated to realize that the war he was fighting was one he'd already lost. The album's most enduring contribution might be what it revealed about the price of fame. Michael Jackson spent his entire life in the public eye, performing since age 5. Never allowed a private moment, never able to make a mistake without it becoming a headline. And history was the sound of someone finally snapping under that pressure. The polite facade crumbling, the performer dropping the mask and showing the exhausted, furious, damaged human being underneath. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't always listenable, but it was real. And in a career defined by illusion and spectacle, that realness, uncomfortable as it was, matters. History is the album where Michael Jackson stopped being a product and became a person people didn't particularly like, but a person nonetheless. And maybe that's the tragedy. That being a person, being flawed and angry and defensive, wasn't allowed for someone like Michael Jackson. His job was to entertain, to inspire, to be larger than life. And when he tried to be human-sized, when he tried to express hurt and rage like any other person would, the world rejected it. Not because the feelings weren't valid, but because they disrupted the fantasy. And the fantasy was what people had paid for. By the time history's promotional cycle ended, Michael was more isolated than ever. The album had been commercially successful but critically divisive. The tour had been profitable but exhausting. And Michael, who'd hoped that speaking his truth would set him free, found himself trapped in the same patterns. Still misunderstood, still under scrutiny, still unable to escape the narrative that had been written about him. The anger that fueled history didn't lead to resolution. It led to more anger, and eventually to numbness, to withdrawal, to the quiet desperation that would characterize Michael's final decade. Because anger, as powerful as it is, isn't a sustainable emotion. You can't live at that intensity forever. Eventually you burn out, or you destroy yourself, or both. History was Michael Jackson's manifesto, his declaration of war against everyone who'd wronged him. And like most declarations of war, it caused more damage than it healed. Not to his enemies, they moved on, but to Michael himself. Because carrying that much rage, that much pain, that much defiance takes a toll. And the toll, in Michael's case, was the last shred of joy he had left in making music. After History, Michael would release 2 more studio albums, Invincible in 2001 after a 6-year gap, and a posthumous collection. But nothing he made after 1995 had the fire of History. Nothing had the same raw emotion, because he'd poured it all out, used it all up, and what was left was exhaustion. The giant statues of Michael Jackson were dismantled and stored in warehouses. Some were sold, some destroyed. None remain in public view today, and that feels appropriate. Because history, for all its bombast and spectacle, was temporary. A moment of defiance that couldn't sustain itself. A scream into the void that echoed briefly and then faded. What remains is the music. 15 songs that document a man at his breaking point. Some brilliant, some misguided. All of them honest in ways that Michael's earlier work never was. History didn't save Michael Jackson. It didn't change the world's opinion of him. But it captured, with uncomfortable clarity, what it felt like to be him in 1995. And maybe that's enough.